welcome back. Beijing's Cravings, Kremlin's Gremlins, Freedom's Foes. To help us navigate this discussion, we have four excellent panelists this afternoon. I'm going to start at this end with Ambassador Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and former Secretary General of ASEAN. Welcome. Pavlo Klimkin, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Thank you very much for joining us. Senator Chris Coons, the Senator from Delaware. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. And Ms. Yun Sun, Co-Director of the East Asia Program at the Stimson Center. Thank you. There's endless talk about the threat from Russia and China. But what does that threat actually amount to? Are these nations, in a sense, united against us, or are they individually opposed to Western democracy? Do they have some sense in which they have a mutual disregard for our democracies, but their own rivalries amongst themselves will stop them from ever being any kind of axis? We have seen some recent cooperation. We saw the Vostok exercises in September, Vostok 18. We also saw, as a counterpoise to that, 29 NATO members of Operation Trident Juncture recently. General Dunford, who has been with us this morning and throughout this conference, said a little while back that it doesn't necessarily equate to a Cold War. Competition doesn't have to be conflict. But from a military perspective, we have two states, he's talking about China and Russia, two states now that can challenge our ability to project power and challenge us in all five domains: ground, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. And, said General Dunford, that's what's different than in the 1990s. I'd like to turn to you first, Senator Coons, with the perspective from the United States Senate. What sort of threat from Russia and China do you think that we are facing?
I think they are fundamental threats, but I think they're significantly different. The very clever film suggested that it might just be an illusion, but sadly it's deadly real. Russia, led by Putin, is a spoiler. Putin is playing a very difficult hand well, but as the paper setting the ground for this panel points out, he has significant challenges, demographically, economically, regionally, that will make it harder and harder for him to sustain his cause, which is the division of the United States from its vital partners, friends, and allies, whether Canada, our North Atlantic Treaty allies, or our allies around the world. China poses a fundamentally different type of threat because it is a country with which we are closely intertwined economically, with which we can and should partner or cooperate in tackling a whole range of things that bedevil the whole world, whether it's nuclear proliferation, terrorism, fentanyl, human trafficking, but where we are inevitably on a trajectory towards competition, and depending on how we manage that competition, potentially real confrontation. The scope and scale of the playing ground on which the United States and China and our allies are now facing each other is much greater, U.S.-China, I think, long-term, than U.S.-Russia. But Russia's aggressiveness, Russia's willingness to invade and occupy territory in adjacent countries, Russia's determination to boldly attack and undermine elections in the United States and a dozen countries across Western and Eastern Europe suggests that in the short term, it poses the more significant threat to our stability and our alliances.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back to Russia's actions in its own west, in our east, in a little while with Mr. Klimkin. But first of all, Yun Sun, would you agree with the analysis that Russia is a spoiler? It can cause problems, but really China is the emerging geostrategic rival. And that's how, if the United States is trying to understand the threat from China, it should see it as an emerging giant power that actually is going to be with us for a long time and can actually have, it has sufficient power to be in Africa, to be purchasing large parts of the global economy, frankly, whereas Russia's really a spoiler. It can still be problematic, but China's really where we should be focusing a lot of our attention.
I think that's a very accurate assessment because the kind of challenge that China represents is more comprehensive. When we look at Russia, we look at Russia's military power, we look at Russia's aggressiveness in terms of its foreign policy and foreign strategy. But when we look at China, China, first of all, is a large economic power, and it has the ability to project its economic investment, its economic statecraft globally. And with that economic investment follows the Chinese more hard power influence in those areas. So looking into the future, I would say that the Chinese development of their national power is much more comprehensive than Russia, especially if you take into consideration the state of the Russian economy and the state of the Russian demography. So I would agree with the assessment that China represents a much more longer term and strategic threat.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Ong, staying in China and in your region, what does the Chinese threat actually amount to? There's the Chinese threat to the United States and United States interests, but you're actually in that very region. How does the threat appear to you on a day-to-day level? I mean, it's very easy. We're sitting in Canada, we could be in the United States, we could be in Britain, and it still has the character of a discussion that takes place on the news. That's not the discussion that takes place for you. It's right in front of you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. Until recently, I would say that most people in Southeast Asia welcome China, China's growth economically. Chinese goods are priced competitively, and China was actually on a charm offensive to make friends with all its southern neighbors. Southeast Asia is to the south of China. But starting from 2009, 2010, when it started to take a very strong position in South China Sea, with regard to its specific maritime claims, of course they call it territorial claims, things started to change, especially in the media reporting. We have 4 countries in Southeast Asia having direct competing claim with China, namely Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei. So when it came across rather strongly, there was a reaction in this country. And then as they are part of ASEAN, we generally discuss this topic across our ASEAN meetings. And more these days, it come across as being a bit assertive. In a certain way, it continues its charm offensive. There are many specific projects on the ground which appeal to the population in the respective country nearest to it. Mm-hmm. Business-wise, it is very strong in many fields. Yeah, but with regard to the position in South China Sea, there is a fundamental disagreement because we feel that whatever the claims, whatever the divergence, we should maintain what we have always advocated, which is we go by the rule of law. And there is an established set of rules, particularly the UN law, the Sea Convention, which can address this issue. So when it started to move on its own and not really take into account our ASEAN commitment to the rule of law and the established rules-based regime, things got really more aggressive, and I would say the population, in particularly the 4 affected countries, have become more sensitive and unhappy.
And presumably nervous. I mean, I was going to say, it's all very well. I mean, and your paper, if anybody hasn't read it, Ambassador Ong wrote the paper for this, for the panel on Asia. And what if China says to hell with the rule of law? I mean, at the end of the day, somebody has to be able to stand up to a country like China. Now, you look around the region, I guess you could look at Japan. There are very important historical reasons why this could be problematic, and there are also geopolitical reasons. China is much bigger and is becoming much bigger economy than Japan. Isn't it the case that without the United States right inside your region, you're in danger of being squashed?
Partly true, but on the other side, China would not like to come across as being a big bully with the smaller countries in Southeast Asia, namely those of us in ASEAN. All of us, even Indonesia with 250 million people, is considered smaller than China. So I think the way we have approached it is to tackle China's claims as a group called ASEAN. And collectively, we may be only half of the Chinese population, but we are all, to put it this way, we think we have a moral high ground, yeah, who can dispute with rule of law and the rules-based regime. After all, China's growth on the international economic level is actually based on established rules, WTO, multilateral trading system, and the way UN and other international organizations, financial institutions operate.
So and you will be used, and you use these arguments as leverage because they believe that the Chinese have a vested interest themselves in at least maintaining a certain respect for the rule of law.
Yes, because if you look at the entire structure of the Chinese economy, it's all based on such kind of rules, which is created by the United States of America and its alliance countries, and they flourish because of these rules. So now you can't say, with regard to the claim in South China Sea, I follow one set of rules, and with regard to my economic interests around the world, you guys all have to follow the rules in WTO and what have you. So that will be bringing out their hypocritical position, if I may say so.
Pavlo Klimkin, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, I suspect we're probably quite quickly going to have to dispense with this notion of Russia and China as a kind of axis working together. But just for the sake of argument and to nail the point, your country, in a certain sense, offers a test case if somebody wants to say that China and Russia are working together. Is China involved at all, at any level, in any way, shape or form in Ukraine? Is there any sense in which China has Russia's back in Ukraine?
Well, it's completely different. I 100% agree with you. You can't compare Russia and China in the sense of them projecting their power. Then I was young and had more time to watch movies. I was a fan of the famous Star Wars sequel. You remember dichotomy, malign empire and democratic rebels. Democratic rebels were destined to win, which is understandable, and the fate of empire was also clear. And I have to disappoint everyone here and basically to warn, the Russians have been getting better. The Russians have been getting better militarily and non-militarily. And their ambitions also have been growing because they want to target the whole democratic world, because they don't need any kind of democratic world based on rules. You know, the point you've mentioned. They want a kind of reality based on deals. In the sense of China, it's completely different. Just imagine what kind of completely positive projection or perception can you get now about Russia? What kind of soft power projection can they get? China is different. And Ukraine is a special point for China. Why? Very simple. The European Commission has just wrapped up a special analysis on China presence in the European neighborhood. Very interesting one, actually. So Russia is fundamentally mistrustful on China. So there is a negative sentiment. The same, but in a different way, is the case for Europe. So the way to have a testing range and try to establish a sort of special influence is definitely Ukraine. And it's why actually, but on a wider range is Central Europe. China established a very special 16+1 format, Central Europe and China. Why exactly Central Europe? And it is clear. But in the case of Russia, it's completely different. It's not about projecting power on Ukraine or Central Europe. Russian ambition on Ukraine is not to set up more pro-Russian reality. Russian ambition on Ukraine is not to have Ukraine at all as democratic and European project and democratic and European society, because the whole fact of our existence and success is a total negation to the Russian model, how Putin's believe he created it. But the sense of time in Russia is quite different from the sense of time in China. China lives in a kind of eternity, understanding that basically this eternal projection is something China needs. Russia lives now, trying to undermine the democratic world now. And it's a fundamental difference between China and Russia. China is good in setting up new rules and new trends. Russia is not about setting up any kind of rules.
So in a sense, perhaps, not to put words into your mouth, that China is a more sober-minded opponent. It's an opponent certainly of our democratic values, but Russia perhaps is more reckless. Is that how you'd put it? Russia needs to have these wins from its opponent of view right now. And one of the connections that's often been made with Russia and China is the question of Crimea. That if we are simply going to allow the annexation of Crimea and at some point just set a reset button and essentially say, look, what's done is done, then why can't China march into Taiwan? I mean, that is the connection that I think a lot of us who are trying to say that we shouldn't be simply allowing this to happen in Crimea. Is this an argument that
I'm always very, very careful about trying to draw parallels in international politics. You know, Putin is very good in trying to draw this parallel between annexation of Crimea and Kosovo, for example, which is both legal and political manipulation. We all know it. So any kind of projection here are definitely not warranted. But in a legal sense, for example, what is going on, in the South China Sea, is in a legal way is very similar on what we've been doing in our cases against Russia. So you can draw probably some legal parallels, but not political parallels here. And fundamentally, the whole way of projection power, it's really my point, is fundamentally different between Russia and China. China tries to establish itself as a kind of different player, a very unique player in the international system. And Russia has been trying to undermine others. It's about getting this negative way, undermining, handling insecurity like a sort of commodity on stock exchange, not fixing up different problems, but creating more problems and having a trade-off. And China is acting, as I understand, it's fundamentally different. So we can't compare basically projection of Russian power and its again neo-imperial sense of creating. Look, our point of our spiritual independence, church independence, in Greek autocephaly, which Russia has been fighting fiercely now. It's again a sort of remnant of the neo-imperial thinking. In China, the whole mentality is completely different. Let's not compare them in this sense.
Robin, the other more important point is that China and the rest of the trading world, I would say, more interdependent. It cannot do certain things which Russia can do, and Russia will say, I don't care what the rest of the world think. In the case of China, you mentioned about Taiwan. They could not just march into Taiwan because the rest of the world may take drastic action and the entire economy of China will be affected. Mm-hmm. So the main situation here is that Russia can do many things and would not care what the rest of the world think unless it is the United States of America.
It's almost, I almost get the sense from what you're arguing that, and perhaps this comes back to one of the things you were saying, and please come in a second, is that China in a sense, it's like a judo player, a small judo player against a large judo player. And, we can almost use its own strength against it in the sense that you're arguing that China has got so much to lose precisely because it's got so much to gain. Yeah. It really has a perspective, whereas Russia has essentially given up on anything apart from, as I said earlier, apart from being a spoiler. Senator Coons, sorry.
Putin is essentially a mixed martial arts boxer, right. Whereas China is playing Go.
Yeah.
They're playing on a much longer horizon. There is a core similarity in a sense of historic grievance and a desire to regain a place of real significance, but with different tools, different strategies, and playing really on different playing fields. China will reshape the world's rules and the way in which we have worked together over 70 years, if we allow it. Russia will punch holes, but will not fundamentally reshape the world.
And does this mean does this mean that China is actually, in a sense, easier to deal with than Russia?
Actually, that means that China is more difficult to deal with than Russia, because when Russia, for example, is aimed at immediate goals to change the narrative or change the content or to influence the immediate result of the election, Chinese are more interested in the infrastructure. They will buy the newspaper, they will buy the news media, and in the long run, that's going to have the impact to project what the Chinese view will eventually look like. So I would say that the Chinese approach is more subtle. It's aimed at the infrastructure, and it has a much longer term calculation to it compared to the Russian plan.
I'm going to ask both Senator Coons and Pavlo Klimkin the same question. To what extent is Russia essentially going to win the conflict in Ukraine? I mean, its ambitions are to keep Crimea, and as far as I can see, just to keep the position in Donetsk and in Luhansk, in the eastern part of your country, something like a sort of a gas stove, where if they want to turn the heat up, they'll turn it up. If they want to turn it down, they'll turn it down. But they don't want the whole thing turned off completely. Senator Coons, first of all, do you have the impression that that is Russia's strategy and that there's very little you can do about it? Or do you actually think you can push Russia out of Ukraine?
I think we can push Russia out of Ukraine, but it requires focus, determination, engagement with our allies, and making this a sustained priority. I grew up as a young man looking at maps of Europe and always noting this little box that was on the side of every American map that said the United States of America does not recognize the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union. And for most of my life as a young man, that was, when would this ever change? How would the Baltic states ever be free? I have had the honor of visiting free Baltic states today.
It did take several decades.
It took decades. And so this is a frozen conflict. I support our president's move, our move to invest in providing more lethal weapons, more support, more training. There are changes Ukraine needs to make as well, but I think in partnership with our vital allies, it is entirely possible
So, I mean,
Ukraine
let's be
to
clear,
regain its
since
lost
nobody is going to invade Ukraine on Ukraine's behalf to kick Russia out, we are talking about a long-term game here, aren't we, Minister? We're not talking about this, in next year or the next 5 years, Russia simply pulling out. This is very much, as the analogy that Senator Coons brought up, it's something like the Baltic states. We've got to play the long game. Can you play that long game?
We play a long game in the sense of, making Ukraine effective and powerful democratic society. It's exactly our goal because it would be not just dangerous, but a kind of fundamental threat to the Russian model itself to have Ukraine as success. But, again, having this comparison between Russia and China, Russia is in a destroying mood. Russia has been trying to destroy everything, and China has been trying to create structures and rules. What kind of rule, what kind of structures is a different issue. But fundamentally, Russia already lost in Ukraine because Russia lost us Ukrainians, in the sense of any kind of, effective relations with Russia. Before the war, just 5 years ago, we had just 19% of Ukrainians who favored us joining NATO. Now it's 55, and it's very constant. So what Putin did fundamentally led to a total reshuffle of Ukraine and Ukrainian society, to a different perception within Ukrainian society. And Putin wanted from the very beginning to break up Ukraine. It was his idea of the Russian world and Novorossiya and to have half of Ukraine as a part of Russian, colony and part of Ukraine as a sort of Russian protectorate, I would say. Now he has Crimea annexed and he has part of Donbass as a Russian protectorate. But the whole Ukraine, free and democratic Ukraine, is not under Russian control. And in that sense, he definitely lost already. But we need everybody to understand and awaken to the Russian threat, because it has taken Russian aggression in Ukraine to have any comprehensive European position towards Russia and to have sanctions, because before there was no case on such comprehensive position. There are still people, politicians, for example, in Germany, we have German representatives here, who believe that by building Nord Stream 2, they could buy a sort of security ticket, saying that, okay, in the 70s, it was a sort of different policy. And my point, if you try to compare Putin's Russia and Brezhnev USSR, you are on the wrong side of history, fundamentally. Because Russia now is something completely different from this, Soviet empire. And at the end of the day, what's gonna happen in Ukraine would mean a lot not only for me and for us, because I do care about Ukraine and my fellow Ukrainians and the fate of Ukraine. But at the same time, it's a kind of patchwork. If Putin is able to have any progress in Ukraine, any progress in Ukraine, it would be a fundamental loss for the whole democratic community. You can't get back to a rule-based world, you can't get back to the transatlantic community as a trendsetter and fundamental player. And how can you talk to China in a way on the same level when you don't have a kind of prospect of winning against Putin in Ukraine? It's a fundamental point for the whole transatlantic community.
Right, Senator Coons, is that point, so, you were nodding your head, so I presume you do agree, is that view and that sentiment widely shared in the United States Senate and in the House, as far as you know?
The view that it's important to stand with Ukraine and to push back on Russian
I think Pavlo is even stronger than that. It's this is fundamental.
And I think the reason we've invested in more forward deployment in the Baltic states and in Poland, in Trident Juncture, which just concluded, in partnering more closely with our NATO allies, is exactly because we see the significance, the historic significance of Ukraine being able to survive democratic and free, even in the face of this steady pressure and aggression from Russia.
And as Pavlo Klimkin said, this has been it's taken a little bit of time, certainly in Europe, but also in the United States. The Trump administration does appear to be taking a stronger, it was very unclear what the Trump administration was going to do on many fronts, but certainly about Ukraine. It does seem that President Trump is taking a much stronger line. Now, is that something that you share, or are you concerned that maybe this is here today, gone tomorrow? Do you think this is a one-time shift?
That's something I share, and I think a number of other senators from both parties share, meaning to sustain our engagement in Eastern and Central Europe, to sustain our support for NATO, and to show our key allies in the region that we're not going anywhere, that we meet our treaty commitments, but that we also support democracy. The thing that I think in the long term will make us successful in our challenge with China and in our confrontation with Russia is the values that unite us with our vital allies, with Canada, with our NATO partners, with our allies around the world. That's what was discussed in a previous panel. If it is Australia and Japan and the United States, Singapore, we have lots of countries around the world that have joined with the United States because we have shared values. China doesn't really have a sphere of influence based on values. They have clients, they have customers, they have nervous neighbors, they have people who are concerned, but they don't have other countries that are saying you have an admirable model for organizing your society. They are attempting to have that influence more and more broadly by investing, by partnering. But I think we still have the values that mobilize and inspire and attract people from around the world to orient their societies towards the human rights that have so defined the last 7 decades of our partnership.
And just one more question on that. Do you have the impression, there's been after the triumphalism of the 1990s and then the 9/11 took up a lot of the 2000s, and the last decade, a lot of it has been the crisis in our democracies. Do you have a sense that as we try and put things back together again, we are going to really come back to the sense that what unites us as a Western community are this sense of values, of democratic values, and that if we don't have that, we have very little else?
That's a view that's widely shared in the United States Senate among the American people. I suspect it'll be heavily litigated in our next election, but I think that is something that undeniably is the underlying core strength of our alliances. I don't see how we can be successful in what will likely be a decades-long confrontation with religiously motivated extremism and terrorism, or with the challenge that China presents to the United States. In both of these contests, if we're not working with our values that inspire our allies to partner with us, we're not going to be successful.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience. The gentleman there, that's the first hand I saw.
Matate Kamiya, professor at the National Defense Academy of Japan. And this is a kind of comment and question to Senator Coons. You said that China doesn't share substantial values with other countries in the world. But I'm afraid that, how to say, China may be presenting a kind of a non-liberal model for economic development.
Yes.
And maybe they do not share values with other countries, but if they can present supremacy of non-liberal model for development than liberal model for development, then they could attract many countries in the world. And I'm worrying about, discussion at this forum tends to focus on traditionally security aspect of the competition between China or Russia and democracies, liberal democracies. In case of Russia, it should be okay because Russia doesn't present any kind of illiberal whatever model for development or whatsoever to us. But China may present that kind of undesirable model to the world. And if we do not present to the world that liberal democracy actually is the good model for development, then what happens? I would like to hear your opinion about this.
Absolutely. I've spent a great deal of time on the continent of Africa. I've been to 29 different countries. I chaired the Africa subcommittee in our Senate for 4 years. And that's the continent, I think, where most clearly you see competing models of development being presented and playing out. China also says, we have a policy of non-interference in your domestic affairs. So we come with a great deal of resources for investment. There is a great deal of need for investment in new infrastructure and in growth. And they don't ask messy or difficult questions about journalists or minority parties or oppressed groups. And so in some countries, that's found great favor and been well received. But I must say, across the vast majority of the countries where I've had the opportunity to lead a delegation from the United States, we hear over and over that from the leadership to average people across the country, they would far prefer partnership with the United States because it speaks to the aspirations and the potential of their people. And today, moving forward, we tend to invest and to develop in partnership, as do many other democracies. The BUILD Act, which was just signed into law by President Trump, which I worked on along with a dozen other members of the House and Senate, will double the amount of investment potential from the United States, private capital guaranteed by the US government. I think that will allow us to re-engage in dozens of countries in a real conversation about is democracy and development a better partnership than state authoritarianism and development. China certainly has a remarkable record of recent development, and some of the Belt and Road Initiative projects are positive projects, but not all. Some of them come with quite significant strings, and some of them pose real challenges to sovereignty.
I want to add, Robin,
Please,
that there's no guarantee that this so-called developing model from China will yield the kind of similar results from what we have already seen in earlier years from other models. So at this moment, although the Chinese model, Senator, looks attractive to some countries, basically it is just for now. Yeah, you have to institutionalize a model if you want to have it copied somewhere else. And if the model is now based on personal, direct contact and deals made between one leader and another from another different country, we do not know what 5 years down the road, what it will be like.
Yunsen, I mean, let's just make sure that we don't miss something here. I'm hoping you're just going to say that there's nothing to worry about, but is there any sense that we might be missing that China has a perception of itself of actually having some values beyond Chinese nationalism and beyond simply the ability to offer a model of development? I mean, is there something that China thinks it has to give the rest of the world which goes beyond that?
Absolutely. That is actually the more long-term and the subtle challenge that China presents to the Western liberal democracy. Because the Chinese government does believe it has a model. It has a model that combines state capitalism, political authoritarianism, social management, but also from their perspective, a high efficiency in terms of development projects. That's pretty much what the foundation for the rapid economic development has been based on. That when the government makes a decision, the public opinion or people's view do not have to be taken into consideration. There's no debate. There's no democratic process in terms of what is going to be what is going to be developed. But in the process of the past 40 years, China was able to use that model to create rapid economic development. And now under the Xi Jinping administration, there's an active campaign from Beijing to promote what they call the Chinese experience in governance, which is the political capacity building, and development, which is the economic capacity building for African countries, for less developed countries. So I see an active campaign from China to promote the China model in less developed countries. And if you ask the Chinese why, I think the essential reason, the explanation is that because the existence of more non-liberal democracy countries in the world justifies the legitimacy of the Chinese system, and it makes the Chinese system more legitimate.
Well, I guess they can at least argue if they can't be, and if they don't have a liberal democratic model to follow, and they don't want to follow that anyway, they can at least make a kind of utilitarian argument that this is our model, provides the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and that's a wonderful thing, and you'll be a very happy country if you follow the Chinese model.
Is everybody happy in China?
Well, I'm not suggesting they are, but I'm saying perhaps the Chinese leadership might argue that case. Is that something they actually do argue?
Well, they argue that, but whether that is true is very much subject to debate. That the fact that the Chinese government feels a need to strengthen the domestic control over the public opinion, over even the Chinese government officials' opinion, I think that's a reflection about how vulnerable they feel about whether their opinions or their views are actually authentically being accepted by the general public. And in other countries, in the countries that I would say that China is trying to promote the China model or export those models to, I agree with Ambassador Ong. I think eventually the game is not decided today. The governments of the authoritarian countries might welcome the China model. They might welcome the Chinese investment in their country, which boosts their legitimacy. But in the long run, these projects are not popular among the people. And in the long run, the question of whether the China model is indeed successful is very much to be seen.
Thank you. There's a question over there.
Hello. I am Mauricio Meshulam from Mexico. A lot has been discussed in this panel about the differences between Russia and China and their approach, but little has been said about their cooperation and the prospects of both of them, Russia and China, tending to collaborate due to the different circumstances. What's your opinion on this?
Well, we did talk a little bit about the Vostok exercise, but perhaps we can talk more about that question. I mean, China and Russia are a big enough problem when taken individually. But are China and Russia cooperating together, Senator Coons? Do you have a sense that they are?
In a few settings and modestly. Most significantly, they have cooperated at the United Nations in ways that have been difficult, that have thwarted some of our efforts, for example, for accountability around their actions in Ukraine, in some ways around Syria and the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad that Putin is keeping in power. There's other ways in which they don't. The military exercise, my strong impression, was more a Chinese visit to a Russian exercise than a genuinely joint exercise. And there are plenty of drivers of tension in terms of access to resources, in terms of their long border, in terms of their history, that I think will reemerge. It would be a genuine strategic challenge for us if they were to actually become closely allied and close partners. But I think there's lots of reasons why we will not see that emerge.
Actually, Senator, in the Central Asian region, your thesis will be proven sooner than later, because with the Chinese moving into the Belt and Road Initiative with all the projects, and Central Asia is the traditional arena for Russian influence. And already you can see projects in Central Asia sponsored by the Chinese, not exactly welcomed by the Russian companies. I don't know how much it will affect Putin, but over time, this might create the discord that people have speculated, and it might not be the same togetherness as we currently think they are together.
Sure.
Look, of course, we've been following, Russian-Chinese cooperation with a lot of attention. It's a very good point about Central Asia, because Chinese creeping engagement in the Central Asia is definitely there, and Russia is very much afraid of that. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, but if you take, China and Russia, this cooperation is fundamentally asymmetric on everything, except probably military and defense cooperation, where Russia still has quite a potential in the sense of technology, especially different kind of weapon system. On everything else, economy, human potential, it's fundamentally asymmetric. The second point, both Russia towards China and China towards Russia, it's not a relations of trust. They are not allies. It's strategic partnership on paper, but they understand each other as representing a kind of fundamental threat. Because look, it's good to see the Russian-China border, where you have Russian depriving economy on one side, small shabby houses and skyscrapers on the Chinese side. And everything which is done on Chinese side is intentional to show this is China. At the end of the day, China would come. Now we have millions of Chinese living in Siberia and in the far eastern Russia. And this encroachment has been definitely growing. So the whole relations between Russia and China is not a kind of relation between two equal partners. It's fundamentally asymmetric. There is no trust in that. And it's going to lead in the future to a number of different conflicts against them. But Chinese approach, I believe, is a smart one in the sense of getting more and more Russia dependent on economy, on the Chinese present in there. It would lead to a total reshuffle of this cooperation, and not in a distant time, but definitely in the mid-run. It's my personal point.
It's John Glenn.
I'm John Glenn with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition in Washington, D.C. I'd like to push us to think a bit more about what our strategic framework for dealing with China and Russia is, and ask you to reflect upon the notion that I think undergirded for so long in the United States Democratic and Republican visions, at least on China, that of Bob Zoellick's call that if only China would be a responsible stakeholder in the international system. It was a vision in which we thought if we get them to participate in the institutions that the United States and its allies created after World War II, we would create incentives and influence on their behavior to shape them. I think it's fairly clear that's no longer true. Let me ask you to reflect on it quickly in where were we wrong, when did we know it, and what are the implications for what we do now?
Ambassador Yong, do you accept that analysis, that we were wrong about that?
Well, I would say that I don't think people are wrong about this approach. There was this wishful thinking, if you like. Fundamentally, you are talking about a communist party, the system, now they call it Chinese characteristic, and the democratic system, which is open, liberal, where every individual can realize his or her potential. So it's earlier session in this Halifax conference, we talked about apple and oranges, right? So this is the situation. You are an apple, how can you be an orange? And you are an orange, how can you be an apple? But then there was this wishful thinking that maybe we can have half an apple and half an orange on the same plate.
Yunsun, how do you relate to that point about the way we've assumed that China, and this is John Glenn's question, we assumed that China wanted to be part of the rules-based order, and that gave us a lot of leverage.
I think, first of all, on the issue of the changing the Chinese system idea, I think we have witnessed plenty of examples of liberal democracy being successful in that region. And especially if you look at Taiwan, Taiwan is basically a part of the original Chinese culture. And the Chinese would say that Taiwan has even a more authentic Chinese culture than mainland China does. But Taiwan has a vibrant democracy, so Taiwan serves as a living example that liberal democracy is applicable and can be successful in a country that has a traditional Chinese value or the Chinese culture. Then in terms of China's attitude towards the international system, China adopts some of the rules, but it's very selective about the rules that they want to adopt. They will adopt those that serve their interest, but also wants to change and reform those that they perceive as not in their interest. So what they call is for the democratization of international relations, which is that Chinese opinion is as legitimate as any other country, and any other country's opinions are. So I think especially under the Xi Jinping administration, with the 19th Party's Congress last year, which made a declaration that this is our system, we're not going to change, and also we're going to try to promote our model in the rest of the world. Then turning to this past March, the two sessions in China basically approved the constitutional revision that removed the term limit on the Chinese presidency. I think those are the two significant signs that the Chinese government made a declaration to the world that we're not going to change.
Just now turning the discussion in the last 8.5 minutes to the question of the actual specific nature of the threat that China and Russia pose to Western countries, to the United States, to Canada, to Britain, to Germany, to all of the countries in the Western world. But let's be more specific and just talk about the question of cyber attacks and the question of interference in elections and social media. China is often talked about as kind of like, the sort of the second part of this whole thing. It's an afterthought, really, to the question of Russia. Are we missing a trick here? Is China, in fact, at least as significant, if not more significant a threat in that regard than Russia?
I think the nature of the Chinese behavior is different. There's a difference between influence and interference, right? So if you look at what China tried to do, basically since the beginning of the trade war with the United States, I would say what the Chinese have tried to do is to influence the American people, to try to use the media outlets that they occupy, use for example, the public relations campaign that the Chinese institutions and Chinese government sponsor here in the United States, and also through the selective tariffs, especially those targeting American farmers. So those are the active influence campaign from China to change the public opinion here in the United States. Then again, the midterm election proves whether China was successful or not. I don't think China was particularly successful, but that also tells us the nature of the Chinese influence campaign is targeted on issues particularly related to China. China doesn't necessarily care about the issues that don't have a direct impact on US-China relations or China's image or China's national interest.
So, I mean, does China have a sense that it wants this or that particular candidate to win the presidential election? I mean, there was certainly, this is one of the biggest ongoing relentless debates in the United States as to whether Russia had any degree of success, but it certainly had a preference as to who it wanted to win the US presidential election. Is China different in that way?
Not necessarily different, but before the 2016 election, the Chinese preferred Trump to be the president. And I would say that preference later, if you ask the Chinese today, that preference was a wrong one.
Well, then be careful what you wish for. And similarly, perhaps, with Ukraine. I mean, President Trump is emerging as being, I put it to you, Mr. Klimkin, much tougher than President Obama was. I mean, Obama had a reset, which essentially gave, and this is the criticism of the Obama administration, essentially handed over large parts of Georgia to Russia and therefore gave the green light to Russia to act in Ukraine whenever it wanted to. Do you feel that President Trump, if President Putin thought that President Trump was going to be an ally, has that been a miscalculation?
I believe Putin fundamentally underestimated the strength of the bipartisan approach in the United States. He fundamentally underestimated the ability of the United States as a leader of the democratic world to act. Now we have consistent increase of sanctions. Now we have, with the support of our friends, defense supplies. We have effective training. We have Ukrainian ability to fight, constantly growing. In this sense, definitely. But going back to the point about Russia and China, Russia sees the foreign policy as a sequence of special operations, basically. It's not about win-win, just a sequence of special operations, just the ability to create trade-offs, to target the democratic world, to undermine the democratic institutions. And the only effective leverage Russia and Putin have in their hands is basically military and special forces potential. At the end of the day, all kinds of important decisions are taken up by one person, the only person in charge of Russia now. China is completely different. There is a system of shaping up and shaking up decisions. It could be intransigent, but it's there. If there is a certain sense of predictability, and China would, wants to play with the whole potential. It's not just military potential and projecting it further. So you can't have the same approach towards Russia, where, which is simply, trying to use this KGB mentality and the special, special services mentality, also projecting foreign policy, and China, which is completely different case.
Putin will keep conducting special operations to keep us off balance, to try and divide us, to demand our attention and our respect. China is playing a very different long-term project. I will just say, paying some attention to the full spectrum interference by China in Australian politics recently is concerning. China has the capacity and the ambition and is now executing on the investment to own 5G, to drive artificial intelligence, and to be not just a peer competitor in the economic sphere and the security sphere, but to reshape the next century, this century, in terms of how all these emerging technologies in which they are not just following the West, but may well be leading or defining the rules for the West. That's a far more fundamental challenge to all of us that requires all of us working together. Let me give credit to President Trump for really stepping up and challenging China directly for a more than 2-decade-long period of taking advantage of the rules of WTO, keeping its own economy closed and generating wealth for its people and resources for its agenda. But I'll also say it was a serious misstep to begin a tariff war with China by first smacking all of our friends and allies and then running into the fight.
Withdrawing from TPP.
And
yes.
Not participating in TPP, I think a huge mistake. Smacking all of our closest friends and allies before starting a big fight, serious mistake. It is my hope that our president will show some agility and that bipartisan engagement by Congress will focus us. A big change I've seen just in the last few years is that the depth and the determination to work out a relationship with China that gives us a likelihood of success is almost uniform across Congress. There is a very rapidly rising clarity about the seriousness of the Chinese challenge to our approach to the world and the need for us to have a well-developed, well-grounded strategy that can only come in partnership with our allies.
Ambassador Ong, I see you want to come in, and please do.
Yeah, Robin, I wanted to make one point. I thought that I agree with what Senator Coons has just said. But also, I think there is a very important point from the Southeast Asian angle. Most of us in Southeast Asia see the role of American business as fundamental. China has developed because American companies invest heavily. American investors encourage their associates and their partners elsewhere in the world to go into the Chinese market. We sense that somewhere in the last 3 years, the American business, the mood has changed. Two reasons. One is basically this idea of transfer of technology and what they see to be China's ability to push ahead on not only technological advancement, but more fundamentally, mobilizing the entire Chinese population into the digitalized economy.
But this is what Senator Coons was essentially driving at, as I understood him, that Russia wants to use and abuse, as it were, the digital revolution. China wants to own the digital revolution, literally own.
Yes, because
At least co-own.
Or at least
At least
co-own.
co-own.
because they see that the only way to dominate the world economy and maybe even the future geopolitical structure is by being able to automate, digitalize, and interconnect. So this is the ambition, and I feel that the American business has started to appreciate the serious implications of this on their own well-being and America's position in the world. So they started to switch their undying support to go into China. Now, no.
A final point, we have run out of time, but Senator Coons, just if you could give a 10-second answer of it, but imagine that you have only
Senators
10 seconds.
can't give 10 seconds.
I know. Well, I can ask a 10-second question. There is a danger that's put out there certainly in Silicon Valley, that in this competition, that the United States and other Western countries are going to over-regulate and maybe break up their tech companies and actually put us at a great disadvantage in terms of competition with China. Is that a concern you're alive to?
Yes, because of what happened in the 2016 election, because of what's happening with GDPR in Europe, and with concerns about privacy by the average American in terms of how much of our lives are controlled and owned by just a few digital companies, the likelihood of regulatory action by Congress is high. But the structure of Congress means that inaction is the default. And in divided government, I think it is unlikely that we will race ahead with very broad and very interventionist
So Sergey Brin and Mark
regulation.
Zuckerberg can relax because you'll have all the best intentions but won't actually be able to do it.
We're going to haul them in front of us and yell at them a lot, and we'll see if it makes any lasting difference.
But Senator, you don't have to worry because there is a supposition in China that the people in China also want to enjoy a good environment and a good life. So it's not the American Congress that will be moving. I think the public opinion in China will come up because you can see the pollution and the problem created in all the cities now. And Xi Jinping is very sensitive to this particular element, right?
Yes,
Yun?
absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be in big trouble, but please give everyone a hand.